Someone I want to see.
My friend Sherlock Holmes.
221B Baker Street.
Hello there. Welcome to my review of The Return of Sherlock Holmes, Series 1, Episode 6, The Man with the Twisted Lip. This story begins in the financial district of London, with a verbose beggar soliciting money from the stockbroker class as he recites Chaucer and Shakespeare. A man walks by and seems to ignore him before we see the beggar has a deformed lip. The man carries on, seemingly haunted by the beggar, before we cut to a woman arriving at Baker Street. Inside, Holmes is absent, and the woman has come to call on Watson, an old friend of hers. She explains she's there on behalf of her husband, who has disappeared to indulge his opium addiction, and he's been gone for 2 days. She gives Watson the address of the opium den she thinks he's at, and wants Watson to go with her. He refuses to allow her to go, and says he will go alone. This is our first episode that really takes us into the dark underbelly of pre-welfare state London, the London of Jack the Ripper, where the very poorest in society dwelled and where the rich would come as tourists to gawk at the poor or indulge their addictions for sex or drugs. We don't get a full sense of how bad it was here, as the show is restricted by budget, but the opium den itself is a nasty, grimy place, filled with people who have succumbed to their most base urges. Watson enters and, in a very matter-of-fact way, asks for his friend, Isa Whitney, who he finds in an opium trance, and who, we discover, is the haunted man from earlier.
Okay.
As Watson goes to leave, sending Isa to a waiting cab, he is grabbed by another opium fiend, who turns out to be Sherlock in disguise. On this occasion, Watson recognizes Holmes immediately, who asks him to meet him outside. Holmes is on a case and asks Watson to accompany him, telling him the details as they travel to Kent. A man named Neville Sinclair, played by Clive Francis, lives in Kent but works in London, and has no money troubles, but has disappeared. He'd left for work as normal on Monday, promising to buy some building blocks for his child. His wife also happened to come into London later that day to collect a package, and found herself in the same street they were just in. Baffled and disorientated by the poverty and strangeness, she glances up and sees Neville in an upstairs room. When she tried to investigate, she was put off by the men who run the opium den. Holmes and Watson arrive at the Sinclairs, and Mrs. Sinclair says she returned to the building with the police, and when they inspected the place, they found the beggar with the twisted lip from the prologue, Mr. Boone. Inspector Bradstreet, played by Dennis Lill, knows Boone and says he's harmless. They can find no indication Sinclair was ever actually there, until Mrs. Sinclair finds the building blocks Neville was supposed to buy and his clothes. Bradstreet, now convinced, searches the building but found no other clues. The police later found Neville's overcoat, stuffed with coins, on the banks of the Thames that the building overlooked. They arrested Boone and are holding him for questioning. This is a beautifully constructed mystery that seems to point in one clear direction before having that direction closed off. I would be interested to know if anyone else who's seen this episode was able to work out what had happened by this point. If so, please let me know in the comments. Holmes and Watson discuss the case, and both think Sinclair is dead.
Watson, if Neville Sinclair is alive and well, why doesn't he come home and demonstrate the fact?
Presumably because he's not alive and well.
But If that is the case, what happened? Holmes is aware of Boone and believes him to be harmless. He has spoken to Bradstreet, who is convinced of Boone's guilt. Sherlock tends to agree, but thinks the Lascar who runs the opium den is involved, and that's what led him to go undercover, but he was unable to discover anything. Holmes lets Watson get some sleep while he meditates on the things about this case that are concerning him, and after 2 hours and a touch of avant-garde filmmaking, manages to formulate a theory, waking Watson up, much to his annoyance.
What time is it?
Dawn.
I've only had 2 hours sleep.
They return to London, and Holmes claims to have the answer in a Gladstone bag. They arrive at the police station, and Holmes demands to see Boone. He asks Bradstreet to open the cell door as quietly as possible, but Boone is still woken by the noise. He becomes terrified by the sight of Holmes wetting a sponge, but can do little to resist. Holmes using it to clean Boone's face. This cleansing reveals the face of Neville Sinclair under the grime and theatrical makeup. As there are now no charges to levy against Sinclair, he didn't murder himself, Bradstreet is furious but has to let him go. When he's fully cleaned and dressed, Sinclair tells Holmes he was prepared to go to prison rather than have his secret revealed to his wife. It all began when, as a journalist, he was asked to write a story about begging, and took on this facade, but found he could make a fortune from begging. But it wasn't until he had to pay off a friend's debt he had backed that he turned to begging as a career. I should explain that in Victorian Britain, if you acted as guarantor on a debt and the person you guaranteed failed to repay the debt, you had to assume the debt. Sinclair continued this routine of begging while pretending to have a regular job for a long time before the unfortunate coincidence of his wife seeing him occurred. He seems truly distraught by what he's put his wife through and promises to leave Boone behind him. The episode ends with him burning his Boone costume as he sees some poor Londoners, unable to so easily escape their destitute life. There's a lot more going on in this episode than just the central plot. I do wonder how convincing the Boone makeup is if you don't know the story, and whether it might benefit from not seeing as much as Neville before the reveal, and whether that matters for the overall enjoyment of the story on the first watch. On repeat viewing, it's still a very clever story, even though Sherlock has very little to do, and his assumptions are wrong up until the very end of the story. What really works for me about this story, though, is how it interweaves several different elements into a 45-minute episode, with the introduction where we see Boone and Whitney before they split off into two very different stories before reconnecting. We see how two men have loving wives, one who has accepted her husband's addiction and deals with it the best she can, and the other who has no idea about her husband's admittedly less destructive addiction. Both fed by the conditions of abject poverty of Victorian London. While Boone is exploiting those conditions, Whitney is a victim of them, and yet we follow Boone's story, and may even be more sympathetic to him. Bradstreet's only objection to his behaviour is that he is making the same amount of money as a gentleman by begging. While it isn't a blatant critique of poverty at the time, that is definitely part of the original story, and this episode, as we see with that final shot of the two paupers that Neville notices. I think that final shot may have worked better if Neville had been hesitating to say goodbye to Boone, until he saw the poor people who don't have the ability to return to the privileged life that he has, and realizing that what he was doing was wrong, not because of how it disgraced his wife, but because it was exploiting those poor people who could never hope to make the kind of money he did without his classical education. I also think this is a story that doesn't necessarily need Holmes, and might have been served better if it was Watson alone who investigated, beginning to end. Not that I resent Holmes being there, I just think it would have been interesting to see. All in all, I think this is an incredibly strong and powerfully but subtle story that is very different to all the other stories in the canon, and I really enjoy it. Absolutely a 5 out of 5 for me. Thank you. Goodbye.